To Sunrise Daily, Mr. Eric Joyce joins us now. He's a member of the British Parliament, and we'll continue our discussion on the Energy and Investment Forum coming to you live from Port Harcourt. Morning, and thank you for coming on today.
What do I think of?
No, I said thank you for coming on this morning. Now, this summit, this investment forum, I mean, we've talked about different aspects of it. For you, why is this important?
Well, I have a refinery, an oil refinery in my constituency in the UK, and everyone in my constituency and in Scotland, the bit of the UK I'm from, knows the importance of the oil industry. They understand how we consume far more than we produce in the UK, and so growing countries with growing oil outputs like Nigeria are sources of oil and gas. That's to start with. So there's a growing awareness of commerce with Nigeria, and of course this conference is in part about investment. And now investment in relation to the oil industry and gas inevitably brings in matters of the environment, and there's very strong regulatory mechanisms in the UK, and in the city in the UK our mechanisms around transparency and accountability of governance when it comes to payments to countries abroad are now very strict, and so the issues of the environment, transparency and accountability all come to the fore.
You know, oftentimes the word environment and oil and gas don't seem to go in the same word. I mean, a lot of people can't seem to reconcile the two, because at the end of the day, some of the end products of what we get from oil and gas are things that get to pollute the environment. And so when they mention environment, oil and gas is always perceived in a negative way. Should it always be that way?
No, of course, you're quite right. Across the world, and I think particularly in the UK, in my experience, people often see oil and gas in a negative light, and yet they consume it every day. They couldn't live without it. The industries rely very heavily upon it. It's a primary energy source for most people in their everyday lives. So there's a growing awareness of environmental implications of oil and gas and all sorts of other things. And you have to find a way of keeping people satisfied that, on the one hand, that the lights are going to stay on, that they're going to continue to drive their cars around and so on, but on the other hand, that they feel that the price of people being able to drive cars is not polluting parts of the world that they don't live in, because we're very conscious that we don't live in Nigeria or in Saudi Arabia or other places that are now, even Venezuela, large oil producers. So there is that political strand, and politicians have to try to make both happen. And in practical terms, people know that they have a powerful demand for oil and gas. So sometimes people sort of tell themselves that some people could sort of do with much less. But there's a very close relationship between oil and gas production and consumption and economic growth. So if people were to have less oil and gas, they would have to accept less growth. And that's something that sometimes environmentalists say, but it's not very convincing to the majority of the population. But people are concerned about it. So it's important that we make sure that the price of our advantages through having power sources that come from elsewhere is that we have a mind for what's going on in those countries as far as their own environmental standards are concerned.
You know, when you talk, staying with the issue of oil and gas and the environment, renewable energy, pulling away from the oil and gas, would almost always be a plus to the environment. Now, but that transition from products of oil and gas, energy from oil and gas, to renewable energy, how would you handle that? Because using less of the oil and gas energy will be a plus to the environment. But you're so dependent, even as you said in the UK, you're so dependent on the oil and gas energy. So how would you transit from there? Because that's one of the things that will be discussed here.
Yes. Yes, I think that it's desirable to have a mix of energy sources, but fossil fuels will be with us for many years to come. And fossil fuels are a source of growth for countries like Nigeria. I think fossil fuels will dominate the world economy for the next 40 or 50 years, to be perfectly frank. I know that some people would like that not to be true, but I think you have to pursue policies on the basis that it will be. As far as renewable energies are concerned, we have, in the UK at least, made a considerable effort with land-based wind farm systems. They're quite difficult to square away financially and commercially, because in the end, at the moment, renewables are more expensive. And so we have a system in the UK of energy regulation which favours the introduction of increasing the amount of renewables into the national grid. And you heard that it was very interesting, your last conversation about the grid, because of course we're fully covered. And the question is what energy sources are used to go into the grid and power the country up. And renewable energy is still quite expensive. It tends to be created in Scotland, where we have more hills, and then you have long lines of transmission to the main population centres, London for example. So it's more expensive to produce it that way. But we are looking at barrages on water, on estuaries. But again, the early investment is very high, it's very expensive. My instinct is that renewable energy will be very hard to spread across as a major power source across the world.
Again, that raises questions about affordability. Do you see us overcoming that challenge?
Yes, I think the harsh reality for people who want to see much more renewable energy is that it's more expensive. And for most people that live, that I work for, my own constituents, they're mainly concerned about energy prices, particularly with the state of the world economy as it is, with people feeling the pinch, finding things more expensive. Energy bills are always going up. So if you want to introduce new renewable energy policies, it's going to cost often the least well-off people more for their power, and that's something we're quite reluctant to do.
Do you ever think that fossil fuels can ever be clean?
Well, clean coal is in its early stages, and again, we have some clean coal investment in the UK, where the coal output's cleaned by the technology. It's quite expensive. There's some experimentation with it in China as well. Again, it's expensive. Some people would say that early investment leads to benefits in the longer term once the investment, has panned out over 5 or 10 years. It's quite difficult to get investors to see the benefit of that because, of course, their returns are going to be much lower. And for most investors trading, they're looking, as you will know, months, weeks, days, hours sometimes ahead, not so much 10 years ahead. So these things are all challenges to be overcome. But I think the reality is that fossil fuels will be with us and they will be a source of growth across countries like Nigeria for many years to come. And so we have to find ways of ensuring that everybody gets the benefit.
For you, what's going to be the most key contribution in the summit?
From my point of view, my main interest is transparency and accountability, so that when large amounts of revenue goes from companies to governments, that we can see that the people get the benefit of that expenditure right across the world. There are some countries where it's difficult to trace where the benefit goes when the receipts exist, but then it just disappears, and you can't see the effect on, for example, infrastructure. And in River State, this is such a good example, actually, of what should be happening with the revenue, because we can see, I believe, 300 new primary schools and 24 new secondary schools, 3 new hospitals, 100 healthcare centres across the River State. And that's the sort of, and of course roads and all the essential infrastructure that you need for business too. And so if we can see that replicated elsewhere in Nigeria and elsewhere in Africa and across the world, then that will be a very good thing.
What about the legal framework in terms of making laws to ensure that the laws are also in tune with developments in that sector?
Yes, I think legislation, of course, rests primarily at the federal level when it comes to oil and gas, but of course at the level of education and health and substantial amounts of control sits at the state level, at River State level, with the governor here. So there's much that you can do as an exemplar. It may not have control of everything, but he can make good examples that other people can follow. And I think that primarily is the role of good governance, harnessing the benefits that you have and creating infrastructure so that everyone can benefit in the end through economic growth and in business investment.
Okay, all right. So you'll be speaking at this summit, wouldn't you?
Yes, I will be. I'll be speaking primarily about exactly that, transparency.
Transparency. All right. How would you suggest or recommend that, for instance, now, Professor Anyesu spoke about him being a scientist, but you will have some scientists who just want to just get down to the lab and get the job done. But you have politicians who have to do what they have to do. Yeah. So if that clash comes, what do they do?
Well, politicians have to listen to the people. Scientists can be very impassioned, and of course, creating access to everyone for the grid it should be a big political objective. But sometimes people will vote for politicians for reasons that are difficult to determine, and politicians have to work in advance. What the compromises they may have to create to be elected. There was a very interesting election result, as you will know, in the last week in Nigeria for a governorship, and it seemed that it may be that while the governor was doing a good job managerially, that there maybe wasn't enough attention paid to very basic issues like food, you know, and if that's what people want to stress, that's what politicians have to focus upon. And this is sometimes how politicians have got to lead the way a little bit when it comes to renewables. It's quite a challenge.
All right, I didn't know you followed that matter. Well, thank you for coming on this morning. Mr. Eric Joyce is a member of the British Parliament. He'll be speaking at this Energy and Investment Forum. We'll be back in just a moment for our next focus here today, so please join us again.